welcome to Hudson Institute. Take two. Hi, how are you? Great, okay. Try it again. Good afternoon and welcome to Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson Institute, and I'm delighted that you could be here today for this important event that in which we're highlighting David Satter's important new book, It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway, Russia and the Communist Past, just published by the Yale University Press. This is, of course, the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and our colleague David Satter has undertaken a very serious attempt to understand the sort of moral causes for the crisis of democracy that Russia faces today. And he notes in this important new book that a serious attempt has never been undertaken in Russia today to understand the meaning of the communist past. And he tries to explain Russia's great historic tragedy, locating its source, as we'll see in a bit, in Russia's failure to appreciate the value of the individual in comparison to the objectives of the state. Hudson Institute is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year, and today's panel is part of our 50th anniversary celebration set of panel discussions. This is the 8th book by a Hudson scholar published this year, so we're particularly proud of this event. We have a very distinguished panel of experts with us today to discuss David's important new book that includes Robert Amsterdam, the noted international lawyer, partner in Amsterdam and Perhoff, who is most notably taken a very active role in human rights cases in the former Soviet Union, most notably in the case of former Yukos CEO Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Miriam Lanskoy, the director for Russia and Eurasia at the National Endowment for Democracy, herself a noted commentator on Russian and Central Asian affairs, and of course Andrei Leonov, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, former chief economist, first chief economic advisor to then President Vladimir Putin, and also former chief advisor to former Prime Minister Chernomyrdin, and a forceful advocate for markets and freedom in Russia. Now, my colleague David Satter himself is a remarkable individual, a Rhodes Scholar, a former correspondent for the Financial Times in Moscow. He writes with great authority on Soviet and Russian issues, combining the subtle analysis of a scholar with the journalist's ability to highlight anecdotes and to bring universal principles or important theoretical principles to light. And his works on Russia and the Soviet Union have been widely read, both his numerous books as well as his op-eds, which have appeared in every major publication literally just about around the world, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, and elsewhere. Now, I should also note, by way of introduction, this is a big month for David, because on December 14th, we've got the book that he sort of has two children that he's given birth to, not quite twins, but within a very short period of time. First is the important new book that the Yale University Press has just published, which we're discussing today. It's available for purchase, $20 in the back of the room at a deep discount, and I urge everyone to purchase a copy of the book. And David also has a film coming out based on the last book, I guess, maybe not, no, it's 2 books ago that you published with the Yale University Press, Age of Delirium, The Decline and Fall of the Soviet Union. And the film will be premiered here in Washington on Wednesday, December 14th at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies at 6:30 p.m. And this is a documentary that looks at life under communism, life in the Soviet Union, and what it was like, as well as the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's a richly documented film that has taken years to produce, with scores of exclusive interviews with noted experts and regular former Soviet citizens. And I urge everyone to attend the premiere, which is Wednesday, for December 14th. On that note, it's with great pleasure that I turn it over to David so we can hear about It Was a Long Time Ago and It Never Happened Anyway. David.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thanks to all of you for attending today's meeting. The book that Ken was referring to as the basis of the movie was the first book that I wrote on Russia. Russia at that time was the core of the Soviet Union, a country that doesn't exist anymore. I wrote a second book about Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, which actually we presented here at Hudson in a meeting just like this some years ago. And now this is the third book that I've written about Russia. And all of them have been dedicated really to the attempt to understand the spirit of Russia. The spirit of Russia is actually the most difficult, in my view, aspect of Russian life for a Westerner to understand. If we had to summarize it in a few words, we could say that in the West, human beings, despite everything, are understood as an end in themselves. Human being, personality, human life is not treated as something that can be lightly disposed of. In Russia, the individual is a means to an end. It can be used for any purpose that the authorities get into their heads in any crazy political scheme. He's devalued, and his life and personality, compared to the great goals of the state, whatever those goals may be, and they often change, has little value. Anybody who had any doubt about this need only to take a walk in Moscow, in the center of Moscow, in the area of Lubyanskaya Ploshchad, which is or Lubyanskaya Square, which was formerly named Dzerzhinsky Square and which was graced at one time by a statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Soviet secret police. If one walks down Bolshaya Dzerzhinsky Street to Varsonovsky Pereulok, or it's Varsonovsky Lane, one is unlikely to pay much attention to a three-story building on that corner, painted green, with friezes of Greek gods and goddesses along the wall, unwashed, and unlike the other buildings in the area, not restored in any way. If you look inside, you might see a photocopying machine. There are air conditioners on the upper floors. There's nothing about the place to suggest that it was a scene of mass executions from 1917 to 1914. That in the basement, a building was called the Ship of Death by residents of the area, and the basement was outfitted as a massive execution chamber. The executioners played dominoes in the courtyard behind the building, and when it was in their spare time, when they weren't busy with their job, and the bodies were taken out in trucks and buried in remote locations, first in the cemeteries of Moscow. Then they were disposed of in the crematoriums, and when there was no room anymore in the crematoriums and no place to put them in the cemeteries, they were trucked out to surrounding areas of the city. In some cases, those surrounding areas themselves became execution grounds, especially during the Great Terror of 1937 and 38. And there are two principal execution sites outside of Moscow: Butova, a suburb southwest of the city, and not far away, Kommunarka, a piece of land that is or was part of the Kommunarka State Farm. In any case, there's no indication that anything unusual took place in that building or at that site. And the only sign of it being involved in politics in any way is a plaque on the wall of the building, which indicates that Felix Dzerzhinsky worked in this building from 1918 until 1920. No indication what he did, no indication what took place there. Not far further down the street on Bolshoi Dzerzhinsky Street is the Sword and Shield restaurant, dedicated to the history of the Russian and Soviet secret police. As you walk in, there's a white marble a white plaster bust of Yuri Andropov surrounded by freshly picked flowers. There are statues of some of the most horrific leaders of the secret police, including Nikolai Yezhov, who was responsible for the Great Terror of 1937-38 until he himself became a victim. Lavrenti Beria, who used to torture and shoot people in his office, including teenagers, and who raped women all over Moscow that he picked up with the help of his guards. And the other odious figures who were the heads of the secret police. And I asked I had dinner there one night, although I found the surroundings extremely unappetizing, because I first of all, of course, I wanted to write about it for this book, but also because I wanted to talk to the manager. And he turned out to be an extremely friendly guy, told me that many people, especially connected to the security services, planned parties, weddings, receptions at the restaurant. The food was quite good, he said. In fact, it wasn't bad as far as I could tell. And I said, well, how do you feel about putting statues of these monsters and portraits of them on the wall? And he said, you can't judge those times by what from the point of view of today. This is history. There were different conditions, a different atmosphere, different requirements of the situation. People were doing their duty. I'll come back to this in a minute. If you leave the Sword and Shield restaurant and walk back across the square, of course you pass the main FSB headquarters, formerly the KGB headquarters, formerly the NKVD headquarters, and before that the headquarters of the Cheka. And there's nothing on the walls to suggest that anything unusual emanated from this building, that the reign of terror that was directed from this spot crippled the country and claimed untold numbers of human lives. Instead, you will see a plaque dedicated to the outstanding state official. In Russian, the word is deyatel. For those of you who speak Russian, I'm not sure quite how I would translate that. Yuri Andropov, who worked in this building between such and such a period. No reference at all to the people who died as a result of the decisions that were taken there. And in fact, KGB and FSB people today, veterans of those organizations, insist that executions did not take place in that building, even though there is an internal prison, a famous internal prison. Of course, interrogations took place there. And under any circumstances, there's no reason to believe that they would tell the truth if executions had taken place there, because the next step would be that some human rights organization would raise the issue of placing a plaque next to that of Yuri Andropov, and apparently no one is interested in doing that, a plaque to the victims. Across the square, there's another building. It's the headquarters of the military colleagues of the Russian Supreme Court. It is here that many of the highest-ranking party and military officials were tried on false charges and sentenced to death. By some counts, 58,000 of them. There's no sign there either that anything unusual had happened. In fact, it's being remodeled and is going to be turned into an entertainment center, shopping and entertainment center. It borders on the dealerships of Ferrari and Maserati and Bentley automobiles, because this is now one of the most exclusive parts of Moscow and one of the most expensive pieces of real estate. So the society has not exactly made huge efforts to commemorate the dead. In 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the statue of Dzerzhinsky, which graced that square, was torn down by a crowd celebrating the defeat of the Soviet Union, and it has not been replaced, although the mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, suggested that it be put back in 2002 on the grounds that without the statue, the square was architecturally incomplete. People at the time pointed out that Lushkov was famous for having absolutely no artistic taste, and the likelihood of him doing this for artistic reasons was next to nil, that he was simply trying to curry favor with the security service veterans who had returned to power in Putin's Russia. Well, why do we face this situation in Russia? Why does this situation exist? The country clearly has much to consider about its past. By most estimates, 20 million people, innocent people, were killed as a direct result of the actions of the communist regime. Those figures are imprecise because the numbers are so great, no one can know the exact number. But that's, at this point, probably the closest estimate that has any kind of plausibility. It does not include those who died as a result of cataclysmic events which were a direct result of the creation of the communist regime. For example, the Russian Civil War, famines which were not exactly provoked by the communist regime, but were the result of conflicts which the communist regime inspired. We're talking about direct victims, people who, people shot, starved to death, worked to death in the labor camps. During the years that I was a correspondent in Moscow for the London Financial Times, it was taken for granted that no one would ever know the fates of those who died, in the sense that no one would know precisely how it happened, what the details were, where they were buried. But with the coming of Glasnost, and the freer access to information in the Soviet Union, information about burial places, about the tactics of interrogators, the scale of the crimes, all began to filter out. Hannah Arendt, in one of her more optimistic observations, said that nonetheless, totalitarian regimes are not perfect. They try to create holes of oblivion for their victims. The victims should disappear as if they never existed. The orders that were given to the local NKVDs who carried out mass purges and mass killings was that the victims were to be buried secretly, and there was to be no information about, with no sign, no monument, no information about the location of the burial grounds. And in fact, to make sure that this would happen, the NKVD had the habit of burying the victims on the territory of their own resorts and rest homes. So their children, in effect, and wives and children would relax and play on the territory on where their victims were buried. And they would often build houses over the bones. And in the case of one NKVD official at least, and probably not only one, they would have toilets and plumbing emptying into the trenches where their victims were buried. The ultimate sign of the degradation of the victims and their failure to see them as anything but units and human raw material. But as word emerged that there were people remember shooting here, people remember seeing trucks in the night carrying victims there, people came upon dead bodies that were not completely covered in another location. Information began to be accumulated. the relatives of victims who had been afraid to discuss the fates of their relatives for so long, in many cases even destroyed their pictures, began to meet and to exchange information. And a movement grew in Russia, which eventually had, in the Soviet Union, eventually had tremendous political importance. The Memorial movement, dedicated to telling the truth about the country's history. And history, for the first time in the Soviet Union, in one of the rare instances in modern history, really became a powerful political force. Memorial soon emerged with chapters in virtually every major Soviet city, and it was seen by the communist regime as a threatening political force. For that reason, it wasn't registered, and it was hampered in various ways. But with the death agony of the Soviet Union, a change came over the movement, and its fundamental vulnerability was revealed, because people backed Memorial only in part out of moral considerations and a desire to commemorate those who had been killed. Many saw telling the truth about history, revealing the truth, as a political weapon against the Soviet regime. And once the Soviet regime had fallen, interest in the fates of those who had been killed began to disappear in Russia. And when Russia was then plunged into an unprecedented not unprecedented, but into a calamitous economic crisis, people were not being paid, and people had to grow their own food in order to survive. Attention to the question of those who had been executed all but disappeared. And when Putin came to power and the situation began to improve economically, the emphasis of the Putin regime, many of whose members came from the security services, was on the greatness of the Russian state. And obviously the theme of the fate of the victims was incompatible with the message that Putin was trying to convey. And so today, we live in Russia faces a situation in which, and the Russian people face a situation in which the past to the full degree is not examined. The burial places are not commemorated. The crimes are not discussed, and their meaning is not discussed. And in particular, the importance of a society that does not regard the individual as the means to an end. And because, in fact, that tradition of using people, of treating them as the means to an end, did not disappear with the Soviet Union. Absent a failure really to examine the question, Russians have fallen back into old habits. And we have once again talk in Russia about the ultimate importance of the Russian state, the glory of Russia being the story of the state's progress, including the period when the state was at its most powerful and threatening, which was the Soviet period. And the failure to create the psychological and moral conditions for eventual democracy and in Russia. Karl Jaspers, in talking about Germany after the Second World War, said that people don't face the real issues. They don't look at the spiritual sources of what happened in Germany. And he said that there's, in addition to criminal guilt, moral guilt, political guilt, there's such a thing as metaphysical guilt. Metaphysical guilt is the guilt that accrues to a society as a result of acts committed in the name of that society, even if a specific individual was not involved in them. Germany has recognized its metaphysical guilt, and everything that goes on in Germany today attests to that fact. Russia has not. And until it does so, and in that way strengthens the notion that the individual is worthy of respect and his fate is important, it's unlikely that Russia can make the progress that it needs in order to save itself toward a decent and law-based democracy. I will now ask my friend and colleague Andrei Ilarionov to continue this discussion.
Should I go here or there?
That's whatever you wish.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I have 7 points that I'd like to mention here, just to give any chance to my colleagues to comment on David's book as well, and to have some discussion here. First of all, I would like to thank David for this book. This is a very good book, very well written and easily read, but the reading will not give you probably some entertainment that could we expect from some other books. And since this book is about memory, so it just, and especially about the memory that either has been lost or has been restored, it is very important for anyone who is Russian citizen or living in Russia, has connection with Russia, that at least somebody from outside could help us to remind some incredibly important part of our history and some events without which the normal life of society cannot happen. As David rightly noticed, not very much discussion is going on in Russia, not only over the last 12 years, which is understandable because of the political regime right now, but even before in the 90s. And I would just look through last, I think, some kind of 25 or 30 years, probably the best time for some kind of for memory and some kind of for recovering this memory was the late 80s and early 90s, and surprise, surprise, shocking surprise under Mr. Gorbachev, the head of Communist Party. So that is why it's some kind of the real picture, what was going in the country is slightly different from the traditional black and white image that we probably have in the back of our mind. So that is why so-called independent Russia, or some people even would be so courageous to say free Russia, and would put in some kind of not completely, it just could be slightly different from very last years of the former Soviet Union. My second point concerns the probably it just the book has many stories, personal stories, stories of hundreds and thousands and millions of people. They are very important, but constantly David comes to the question of what is the reason, or what are the reasons of the what he sees as a passivity of substantial portion of population and impunity of new so-called ruling elite, or new caste, or new nobility, as all those terms becoming now very well known. And here I think David is right, but I think it is necessary to probably to make one more step forward and just to adjust a little bit our understanding what really happened in the country and what is going on right now. I think the terms communism and communist past is very important, and it should be studied and should be analyzed, and it should not be forgotten, and should be what is going today should be traced to the communist past, no doubt. This is a very important element. But at the same time, I think we need to some kind of to correct our understanding of the history, because Communist Party is no longer at power for 20 years in Russia. Nevertheless, many features of the current political regime and some kind of ideological some kind of surroundings to some extent similar to what we had before, and actually some kind of could be traced to the previous years. And actually, Communist Party, or some kind of the those who call them themselves communists, are in opposition to the current regime. And those who following events, including the yesterday's so-called special operation about the election, so could see that sometimes, and actually quite often, at least some kind of normal communists, some kind of members of the party, not the leadership, behave relatively some kind of honestly, and not relatively, but honestly, and especially towards the current regime. So it's some kind of quite unusual situation for traditional dichotomy between communists and some kind of the liberal or democratic opposition. The current regime is actually fighting with many other people, including some kind of the let's say new generation or whatever of different people. So that is why I would say, especially David spent a lot of time discussing it, just to put more attention not only to communist ideas, communist ideology, which is very important, but also to the ideology of the state ideology, and to the ideology of belonging people to the state, and to a particular element of the state as special services or secret services or political police, because the current political regime is clearly the regime, which is pretty rare nowadays in the world, is a regime that has been created by officers of political police, secret political police of the past, that dropped communist ideology. And not only dropped communist ideology, they destroy this, and trying to destroy this communist ideology, they consider it is outdated and actually pretty the enemy to themselves. So they feel themselves much better not to be restricted by any ideology at all, and especially by communist ideology. So that is why some kind of to understand the nature of the current regime, and even to understand the nature of the previous regime, because it is also not very clearly communist according to Marx or whoever. That just we need to some kind of to adjust our understanding. What does it mean, this totalitarian system based not only on communist ideology but also on the totalitarian power of secret political police. And here we need to look into these roots not only of communism but all this, let's say, some kind of secret police state. And here we're coming to, since this is the usual questions, I would mention at least two elements that I think are very important in understanding of the current Russia and understanding some other countries that happen to be in this historical incident for several decades. Because some important elements of social fabric have been destroyed in those countries, and probably not in all those countries it was possible to restore some of these elements. And I would mention at least two elements. One is the massive and persistent execution and some kind of physical removal of all people who are in charge in a normal society for the so-called horizontal ties, horizontal connections, like some kind of merchants, some kind of teachers, professors, doctors, clerics, people who were in the previous so-called bourgeois regimes, like some kind of the members of the government, or heads of police, or heads of the army, and so on. So just it's almost complete elimination, and in some countries really complete elimination of all those people, and at the same time massive indoctrination of the remaining population with new ideology and subversion to the new government and to the new state, and also some kind of putting a lot of the real agents and so kind of secret agents, or sexots in Russian, секретный сотрудник, secret collaborators into society. It is rather hard to imagine for people who did not live in the former Soviet Union or in the countries of the communist bloc, just how widespread the system of secret agents developed in a society. Just you cannot probably imagine that almost anyone who, some kind of young person, some kind of between some kind of 20 and 30 years old, who some kind of happen to be interesting, entrepreneurial, some kind of attractive, some kind of professional, is being some kind of contacted by, is being contacted by KGB officers with the some kind of very clear suggestion to cooperate with secret police. And due to this totalitarian pressure, very, very few were able to refuse. And most of them did agree. And all those people who some kind of gave their some kind of agreement in the past, so they live today in the country, and some kind of they continue to occupy very different and very important positions, and there's some kind of their contract with the secret police is still valid. And in very many cases, as we can see, so just they continue some cooperation and collaboration in this regard. So this is a very special social organism, social body that we could not find in any traditional authoritarian regimes, or even some authoritarian regimes that we know in many other parts of the world. Next point, just to see how this system developed over the last 20 years. There is exists very interesting number of studies by Olga Krishtanovskaya, a very renowned Russian sociologist, who studied the personal biographies of the so-called elite, those who came to power in the executive power, in legislative power, in the presidential administration, in the government, in the State Duma, and so on. And she was studying these some kind of ways of political elites, evolution of political elites in Russia for the last several decades. And her numbers are strikingly revealing. Under Mr. Gorbachev in the 1988, the share of secret police officers within roughly 1,000, it's slightly more, slightly less, it's 1,000, the highest ranking officials in the Soviet/Russian societies was 5%. Within next 10 years, under the so-called Yeltsin regime, so which we can see the democratic or whatever, the share of the secret police officers in the society jumped to 50%, according to her studies. And under Mr. Putin, it came to 75 to 80%, depending on the criteria that she's using. So this is a staggering numbers. Today, 3/4 or maybe 4/5 of the 1,000 people in the top Russian elite have either clear secret police or intelligence background, or some kind of, is it open, or some kind of still secret, it is not open, but by some number and by some methodology it can be identified this background. And that's a really striking, even under some kind of Stalin and with Beria and with Yezhov. It was some kind of real terror, with a massive terror, with millions of people killed. Nevertheless, secret police did not have political power. What we have today, that these some kind of people who came from the same ranks and who actually share this ideology and actually methodology and methods of against other people, they comprise absolute majority of political class and political elite in the country. And it gives us some flavor of understanding how serious is the situation in the country, and this situation cannot be solved easily, neither in a short period of time, and definitely not under this political regime. And what has been discussed over years about transition from so-called communist system or some kind of central planned economy to democratic system and to market economy. It was a lot has been said about markets, about importance of transition in economy, and it is good, it is correct. But it looks like it's much more important to study and to discuss, which has not been done yet to necessary extent, to necessary level, is the discussing of the transition within society, transition of different sociological stratas, who comes to power, who are those people, what kind of ideology and views do they have, and what kind of vision, and what it could have for the current stage and for the future of the country. I would mention my last point here, that it is really true that it's incredibly difficult not only some kind of to make any steps forward in this regard, but even to discuss the basics of our national history and some of, especially these painful pages for national memory and for national present time of the country. I would mention one example that I happen to be involved for last couple of years very seriously, since I was also interested why some kind of the country, Russia, was not making much progress on the way to democracy and to rule of law and some kind of modern standards of the country over the last 20 years. And gradually, one by one, I came to conclusion, and it has been some kind of written a number of texts, and some kind of we can discuss it later. But just it seems, it looks like that there's some kind of very important decisions have been taken, certainly in year 2003 when Mr. Khodorkovsky has been arrested. In 1999 when all this apartment bombing happened and Mr. Yeltsin appointed Mr. Putin as his successor. And in some previous years, but probably the crucial turning point in the current Russian history happened in November 1991. Certainly after August 91, it's just definitely one of the most important, but after that in November 91. And when studying it, this, I found that the person who was considered as a very painful, actually, revelation for myself first, and certainly for many people who just found this, that the person who considered as some kind of reformer, liberal, some kind of the Democrat, the person who could bring Russia to a new situation, Mr. Yegor Gaidar, whom many people here know, was a very close collaborator with the secret police of Russia, with KGB. And he was, and his position as the deputy prime minister, responsible for economic and financial affairs, and later as the acting prime minister, did enormous things that just compare either previous acts of other people or following ones. In the midst of the probably harshest Russian economic crisis in December 91, January 92, he sent about 200 million US dollars as a secret operation. It was not reflected in the Russian budget. It's a very special secret operation to support Fidel Castro for some kind of financing intelligence center that Russia has inherited from the Soviet Union to some kind of to eavesdropping the Western Hemisphere. It is worth to mention that the support of these 200 million US dollars that time was more than monthly expenditures of the total Russian federal budget, which was that time was 147 million US dollars. And just you can imagine that the some kind of the head of the government that's sending just as a one operation more than the total expenditures for rest, for everything that is in the country, including social expenditure, including police, including army, including administration, including health, including education, everything. Just to understand the some kind of the priorities in the head of such a decision. Later in the autumn of 1992, the first tranche that Russia has received from the IMF, $1 billion US. It's the first tranche, actually first credit that Russia has received from the IMF. Mr. Gaidar has sent to save from bankruptcy of the Eurobank based in Paris, in France. That the official name is a commercial bank for North Europe. The bank that has been used for several decades by NKVD and KGB for financing special and undermining operations of this organization in the Western Europe. And there's some kind of the substantial, some kind of the rise of the shares of KGB or some kind of secret agents in the government and the political elite started exactly in November 91. And just number of people have been appointed by Mr. Gaidar have been these people with clear KGB background. I mentioned this example just to demonstrate how uneasy, how painful, and how frankly speaking, sometimes horrible history of the country, not only in the past, which we know a little bit, not much, but a little bit, but it continues to be right away. And that's a very important some kind of message that the exit from the system, the treatment of society and the whole political system and of all those people with such a background cannot be very easy and it cannot come very fast. Thank you.
Miriam, do you want to?
Yeah, okay. Can I stay here?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
Yeah, I'll stay here. I thought this was a beautifully crafted book. Sorry. Okay. I thought this was a beautifully crafted book. There's a strong and persuasive analytical argument, but it's unveiled in a very subtle and literary way. There are passages that are history, there are interviews with people who'd been touched by the terror or their families had been touched by the terror. There are stories about their lives, and then there are different visits to former camps and to burial sites. And David has a remarkable breadth in the way that he approaches the issue. He comes at it from a lot of different angles and uses all kinds of sources. So the argument emerges from very different sources and from very different experiences, and it kind of I almost feel uncomfortable pulling out the kind of hard analytical bits because there's so much that is just very good literature and good history that's there. The approach shows well where Russia is in confronting its past and why this failure to confront the past impedes any kind of progress towards democracy. And it also explores the psychology of people, and I think does a remarkably good job of that. And I can give an example. There was, if just from my own experiences that this helped me to understand. There was, I hesitate to even call it an opening. There was a kind of brief window in Uzbekistan in 2002, 2003, when a little bit of human rights work was possible, and I was there working for NED, looking for possible projects. And I was in Tashkent, and someone had suggested that I go to a small town to visit this woman because she was in the provinces, in the Fergana Valley, and she was trying to do human rights work, and it was all kind of new, and the possibility for what could be done was very new. So her name was Mutabar Tajabayeva, and I met with her, and she was trying to get the Uzbek justice system to kind of carry out its own rules, which was amazing. And she was writing appeals and going to the police and to courts with people and so forth. So I came back here, and then in a few months, that tiny little window, it closed, and she and a lot of people like her went to jail. And while she was in jail, she was raped, and she had some sort of operation. She knows that she had an operation, but it's not clear. They won't admit what it is that they did to her. The implication is that she was sterilized. After a few years, she was a very prominent political prisoner. After a few years, she was released. She moved to Europe. She came to Washington to see us. And then I had one of the sort of weirdest and most disturbing meetings of my life, because the only thing that she wanted to talk to me about was that she wasn't guilty. And for me, it was unnecessary for her to explain that she wasn't guilty of whatever it was that they had charged her with. They had charged her with, I think it was economic crimes or whatever. I regard Karimov as guilty, his government, his jailers as guilty. Didn't occur to, she was guilty of human rights work. But the psychology of that, and that was literally the only thing she wanted to talk about. But the psychology of that, I don't think I understood until I read the passages in this book about rehabilitation. And rehabilitation was this process that the people that came out of the camps went through to try to clear their names. The problem with it is that it kept the Stalinist system completely intact. It was the individual who had to prove that he or she was innocent, but there was no responsibility whatsoever on the government. And I just want to read a small paragraph about rehabilitation. The rehabilitation of millions with no acknowledgement of the historical responsibility of the state meant that the sufferers remained within the relationship of the individual to the state that had long been inculcated by the Soviet regime. The government had victimized a person, and yet the individual had to appeal to the same government to clear his name. The recognition of the Soviet regime's responsibility in the preamble to the new law on rehabilitation was important, but it came in October of '91 as the Soviet Union was about to disappear. The process did not and could not make the point that in the cases of mass atrocities, accepting responsibility and making restitution is the obligation of the state. And this is different than just coming to grips with the past, which could be a kind of personal process, or it could be doing the sort of things that Memorial does, which is restore sites and build museums, establish historical accuracy. Or there's another passage somewhere in here about the Russian Orthodox Church, where I guess one of the priests says, well, we pray for the victims. There are all kinds of ways. And it seems completely unsatisfactory to pray for the souls of the victims. It's kind of a good step, but it doesn't get at the point, which is to establish that responsibility, establish that the state is responsible. And of course, this is a necessary precondition for a development of democracy in Russia. Until the state is actually responsible to its citizens, and you can have the principle of accountability, not just the duty of the citizen to the state, you can't go on to a more democratic system. And that lack of responsibility, of state responsibility, it connects to the moral failures in today's Russia, and it also connects to Russian nationalism and even the intellectual roots. And I think David does a wonderful job of talking about these different strands of there are passages on Berdyaev and Solzhenitsyn and kind of Russian intellectual tradition of connecting the nationalism with the Soviet crimes and with today's moral failures. And I'm going to read one more kind of provocative short passage about the Russia's special way, the role of Russian nationalism in all of this. Besides being a matter of vanity, the notion of Russia's special way and saving mission is a fundamental element of psychological integration. A Russian lives without freedom, but in his own mind he is not a slave. He is a participant in a grand enterprise with which he and his fellow citizens can be entrusted, and which requires sacrifice and readiness to accept total subordination. Calling attention to society's moral responsibility to the victims of communism, which cannot be done without acknowledging the responsibility of the Russian state, suggests that such subordination is not justified. It would require calling Russians' entire self-identification into question. This is why an admission of guilt by the state is so difficult. And I think that's, it sort of, once it's been articulated, it sounds simple, but it's an incredibly important psychological portrait and fact of the situation. The conventional wisdom is that Russia's political system today is devoid of ideology. I think this is wrong. There is a strong ideology, and it's the ideology of a powerful state as a driving force in history. and that the role of society and the individual is to support that state. And this ideology is consistent from the imperial period to the Soviet period and to today. I think that the argument makes a lot of sense, and it is also extremely well articulated. And I almost want, once you've read the book, you feel like you've always known this, which of course I didn't, but it just seems natural. And there's a lot of compassion for the suffering of Russian people. And it comes through very vividly through many interviews and portraits of different people. And I thought it was a powerful argument, and it's beautifully told, and it provides a very compelling explanation for why Russia remains authoritarian.
Firstly, I want to say that I think David Satter has done a remarkable job in this book in speaking truth to power. I think it is very important to understand, and I say this as a lawyer, that with the passage of time, it will be impossible to try those people who caused so many of these murders. But I must say, human rights organizations in the world today overemphasize this issue of individual accountability. Part of the problem in Russia today is the systemic issue, what Primo Levi, when he spoke of the Holocaust, called the gray zone. Those people who were doing their duty, who committed the crimes within the context of doing their duty. And the problem we all need to face is those people are in power in Russia today. We are not going to have the accountability because so many of the perpetrators are either in power or close to it and need to continue the ideology that they grow with now, because to allow for that dramatic historical break delegitimizes their claim to power. So to that extent, it is an impossibility in a way for us to seek from Medvedev, as many did, or from Putin, any dramatic change. And you know, it was incredible to watch the transfer of power between Putin and Medvedev, the incredible cynicism, the belief in their own impunity, the belief, as in Soviet times, that they could do something so clearly farcical and get away with it. And I think this has to do with another aspect of the gray zone, with another aspect of what Levi teaches us. Because very often, those people who engage in crime pretend to be the victim. And one of the powerful issues in Russia today is the continuing victim narrative of the entire country. It is very difficult to attack Russia. We are constantly apologizing to Russia for pointing out the fact that Eastern Europe was occupied. We need to restart our relations with Russia, but Russia doesn't need to address its past. We in the United States engage in this phony Faustian bargain with Russia and are surprised that it does not change. I will tell you, after having represented Khodorkovsky in the first trial, I departed the case a year and a half ago and have been working in Thailand for the Red Shirt movement. And I myself was caught up in the Bangkok massacre in 2010. And I was shocked to find that so much of what I'd seen in Russia was happening in Thailand. In fact, the Thais had been murdering their own citizens through the use of the army in 73, 76, 92. No one had ever been brought to justice. And I'm proud to say we filed on behalf of the 12 million red shirts a demand at the ICC that Abbasid, who was then the prime minister and ordered the murder of these people, face justice. Even though Thailand wasn't a member, we filed. And thank God found out that Abbasid himself was a citizen of the United Kingdom, and therefore we had the ability to name him as a perpetrator. And I am very glad to tell you that last week, for the first time in the history of Thailand, a former prime minister was brought to the police for questioning about mass murder. And I want to tell you today that we all who care about Russia need to understand that those who commit mass murder can be brought to justice. There must be a way. We cannot accept the present. It cannot be left only to David Satter and those like him who have the courage to present this history. It cannot be left only to them to call them to account. How long can we continue an opportunistic foreign policy that allows us to pretend we are resetting with people our own diplomats say are running a mafia state? Do we need more evidence than Satter's book, among others, to convince us that there is something morally wrong in not demanding change? How long are we going to accept the sovereignist ideology of the Soviets that if it occurs within that state, we cannot criticize or complain? Hillary Clinton went to Tashkent 2 weeks ago and praised the Uzbeks, a country that boils its citizens alive for protest, a country that recently jailed, in a case I've been involved with, jailed a number of employees in a dispute clearly only over money, and one of them perished last week. This is 2011, and this goes on. And I can tell you that in speaking of the new Eurasian aspects that Vladimir Putin is talking about, that his new embrace of Eurasia, there is a rebirth of an expansionist ideology that is going on. Yes, it may be because they are intellectually and ideologically bankrupt at this point, but there is still this attempt, and Putin has made tremendous progress in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, in Georgia after the Georgia War. There has been real progress made by the Russians. And this book is important because it is descriptive of some of the dialectics of Russia today and some of the dialectics of power. Because one of the things I've always argued is that Putin's vertical of power represents a horizontal of incompetence. Things just can't get done. And one of the reasons it can't get done is the destruction of the internal institutions. In David's book at page 66, a very interesting comment. Under Stalin, persons bring a certain amount of power were not only executors of an alien will, but in their area of authority, all-powerful. This acted like a narcotic. What Satter says about Russia is true of everywhere there are no limitations on those who exercise power. And within this book, there's an incredibly powerful passage at the end that I'd like to read at page 275. The authoritarian regime that was introduced by Putin all over Russia is reproduced to an even greater degree in Vorkuta. Officials used any excuse to reduce pensions in order to divert money to themselves. The creation of an atmosphere of moral indifference encourages people to turn their backs on other, more recent crimes. Indeed, the lesson of this book is that impunity is not a symptom. Impunity is a goal. And we are fostering that goal through the reset. We are actively supporting it through our opportunism. We cannot stand here. We cannot stand here and blame Putin and blame Medvedev. The problem lies in ourselves. And until we grasp that there will be more murders in Bangkok and Moscow, more illegal arrests, more brave men like Khodorkovsky locked in jails for God knows how long, until we understand our moral imperative to act, until we understand that, books like Satter's will be the only support those brave people in Moscow have who man the barricades fighting our fight. Thank you very much.
Now I think we'll just ask. Okay. Well, thanks to all of our speakers, and I think now we can take questions from the audience. Please, this gentleman, if you would identify yourself, the microphone will be brought to you. Just identify yourself, get your name and affiliation.
Stuart Reuter, retired Cold Warrior.
Thank you.
I have sort of a two-part question. Most of what we've talked about today has used Moscow as its locale. Is the rest of Russia in its far-flung cities and towns also fighting the same problems? And the second part would be, it seems to me that Russia, the Soviet Union, back to the Tsars, never had a time of essential freedom, whereas Eastern Europe, the Hungarians, the Czechs, had a period of democracy, of capitalism, which was still within memory, at least of my grandfather type of memory. And has that been a big difference?
Does anyone, Andre, do you?
On the second question, frankly speaking, I didn't understand the first one. But it seems to me when we're using the term Moscow, meaning the whole country, definitely, probably Moscow is slightly, not much, but slightly better in the sense that just more movement, some kind of more access to mass media, to international organizations and so on, but the rest of the country is in much worse situation usually. As for the second comment concerning the Russian Empire and people in the Russian Empire did not enjoy the same freedom in the Europe, it's correct. But nevertheless, just the mass horrors that have been brought by communist / secret police regime over the 70 years on the 20th century has not been seen in the whole Russian history. It is absolutely unique. It is unprecedented. Just whatever we can say about the same kind of crimes of the Tsars, of anyone, it is incomparable to what has happened in the 20th century. It just is incomparable, even with Ivan the Terrible, with the worst cases of the tragedies in the Russian history. So this is really unique event, and just that is why it is absolutely necessary to study this event and to understand this event. It's incredibly important for the country, for Russia, but it's also incredibly important for the rest of the world, because those systems that have been created in Russia later have been brought to many other countries with very similar consequences. So that is why, unfortunately, it became not only some kind of unique national experience, but unfortunately, it became international experience. And unfortunately, it did not finish. It's still with us in a very new forms and very new shape.
Yes, this gentleman here in the front row.
I'm Gil Rosman, professor at Princeton University. I want to make first a comment that in looking at the Russian spirit and the Russian identity, I think it's essential to try to find elements of that lead in a different direction, and try to suggest how even a state identity, which is so dominant, has the potential to be reshaped rather than to demonize it. But I'm doing my own research on comparing Russia and China, and so much of what has been said about Russia could have just easily been said about China. The parallels are really striking. And I have to say, finally, that I'm terribly in disagreement with the argument that the reset is wrong because of these moral objections to what's gone on in Russia. I think that is a misreading of the possibility, and that drives us into a situation where we demonize Russia. The same thing could be done with China without trying to figure out how we can find some common ground. And that is why I want to hear what about Russian national identity. And the Graham Gill book that came out recently is a very helpful one in this regard, in tracing the Russian meta-narrative and how it failed in the Gorbachev era. What about Russian national identity can we build on rather than just emphasizing all the negatives that rightly have to be pointed out?
I think that Bob will want to say something on the reset question. I will briefly comment on the question of positive elements in the Russian state tradition. I think there are positive elements in the Russian historical tradition, not in the state tradition. Certainly not as it's being interpreted at the present time. The problem is that the Russian state tradition is the tradition of treating the individual as if he has no value vis-a-vis the goals of the state. I don't think that that is a very fruitful approach, and I don't think it gives us very much hope for the future. I think that where Russia has been rich is in its oppositional tradition, the tradition of the Decembrists, the tradition of the February Revolution, the literary and intellectual opposition, the Soviet dissidents, Andrei Sakharov. And these people have created works that have influenced the entire world. They've influenced Russian society, and they stand as an alternative to the Russian state tradition, upon which Russia has drawn in the past. It was fundamental to the peaceful revolution that overthrew the communist regime, and can become very important in the future. Now, on this subject of the reset, I think Bob may wish to respond.
I think it's very important to draw a difference between Russia and Putin and the present government. Nobody, certainly nobody here, would say anything negative about Russia's historic image. The reset with Mr. Putin, let's be clear, U.S. embassy documents say that Mr. Putin is running a mafia state. And let me tell you, sir, as someone who was engaged in the defense of Khodorkovsky and was personally arrested and detained in Russia, the only thing these people formerly in the security services understand is power, unfortunately. Envisioning the beauty of Russia that I know and love, Anna Politkovskaya said to me, the biggest problem was the Americans who dream of what Russia could be instead of reacting to what Russia is. And the problem is, I mean, the first day of the Khodorkovsky trial, I'm there with our senior Russian counsel, and I say to him, surely to God, Putin will understand how negative this is for Russia. So this old man who was a lawyer under Stalin literally hits me across the head and says, never speak so stupidly again. The Russian leadership only understand what they can steal today. They only care about what they can steal today. Don't even worry about what they can steal tomorrow. Stop being a fantasist. And I think as I sat in Russia, as Sandy, who's here now, still sits in Russia, and dealt with that case, and with other cases. We just were in an arbitration with the Russian state in Stockholm 2 weeks ago. It is shocking how the necessity to play hardball with these folks appears to bear itself out time and time again. But these folks are different than the Russian people. And the point is, Igor Sechin is not an exemplar of Russia. And we understand that, and it's critical to stress that. I have hope that past this group, this cabal that's in control, Russia may have a great future.
I think Andrei had a remark that he wanted to make as well.
Two remarks. The first, it's hard to add to what David and Bob have said, but just I would reiterate the point that you should not some kind of mixed Russia and the current regime. You should always distinguish between those two. It's not just an issue about demonizing Russia, it's necessity to talk about the political regime, which is not Russia, and which is another Russia and another people that are having nothing common with the current regime. It's the first one. And second, I think the justice making this comparison with China is factually incorrect. Current Russia and current China are very different political system and very different legal system. Just with all problems that China has, and they have some kind of a lot of problems, it is not a mafia state. While the current Russia is and there's a big difference. So the current Chinese leadership is being consisted of the just technocrats, communist leaders, or whoever, but their understanding of legal issues is fundamentally different from understanding of the Kremlin leaders. And this is shocking, because if you look into any indicators of rule of law international, whatever you will take it, just you would find some kind of striking distance between China and Russia. China still being some kind of poor in terms of GDP per capita than Russia, but it has much higher, substantially higher, all those legal indicators than Russia, which actually goes against the traditional studying and correlations in this some kind of political and economic analysis. So that is why it's a different country. So just please don't mix them.
Okay, we have other questions. This we'll try to get to everyone. This gentleman in the far, but you'll wait till the microphone comes to you.
Thank you. It would be entertaining, if not illuminating, to conduct a further discussion about how.
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, Frederick Peterson, U.S. Freedom Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
As to how we can conduct a reset without ever addressing the question of mutuality, of common objectives, and a commonality of means. Otherwise, it's an entertaining a delusion that is very, very dangerous. But my question is not regarding that, although I'd like to hear more of that. It's fascinating. What I would like to address, have the panel address, is the demographic issue. It may be that Russia itself is entertaining its own delusion, and that is that they will have a future sitting on the worst demographic decline in their history and the worst rates in Europe. They're breeding a future that is empty. And
maybe we could ask Andre to react to that. We have a lot of people who want to ask questions, so we have to keep the questions fairly brief.
Yes, just as a matter of fact, demographic situation in Ukraine is worse than in Russia. Now, it does not some kind of make a big difference, but just to know the facts. Demographic problems could be considered as also as a result of the political system that was in Russia in the former Soviet Union for previous 70 years, and for the policies that have been introduced in our countries over the last 20 years that David has referred to as another stage of social engineering. That's a problem. It's not the problem of reforms, but it's a problem of social engineering and some kind of conducting experiment over millions of people. And usually people, they are not some kind of the animals in the zoo. So they react to all these experiments just by dying, especially if this treatment is especially harsh. So that is why we need to certainly not to overlook what has been done in the previous 70 years, but we also should not forget and some kind of not to attach necessary attention to what has been done over the last 20 years and especially in the 90s.
Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Peter Evans. My wife and I have a website called Politics and Prayer, and we believe that politics is applied theology, basically. And the question relates to the apparent resurgence of the Russian Orthodox Church, nominally 140 million Christians, bursting forth from the collapse of the atheist regime. And I wonder if you have any observations on the significance or lack of significance of this apparent flourishing.
Okay, Andre probably will have something to say about that. I'll say very briefly that I don't consider Russia to be a particularly religious country. I think that a lot of that is purely formal. And certainly the Russian Orthodox, although on the level of ordinary priests and local churches, the people get a lot of comfort from religion, but at the level of the hierarchy, the Russian Orthodox Church is completely corrupt and a tool of the regime, never taken a real moral position on any of really significant issues. For example, the person who is now the patriarch has argued that human rights cannot be a priority. In this he was backed, among other things, by among others Solzhenitsyn. The priority has to be the preservation of the nation. Well, this is clearly as interpreted by whom? By the authorities, of course. But Andrei, perhaps you have some.
There is some resurgence of Orthodox Church among some minority of the Russian population. That it's true over the last some kind of 20-25 years. Some people really started to go to the church, especially in front of the failure of the communist ideology and a failure of any other ideology that could replace communist ideology, which actually still is not the case in Russia. So that some people just move there. But in general, I would support the views of David that just in many cases, in majority, it's very superficial. It's for some kind of for demonstration effect. And the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church is fully or almost fully has been recruited by KGB during the Soviet time and continues these relations. It is incredibly heavily corrupted, and it was true in the 90s and it's true today. And one of the probably the biggest, maybe the biggest mansion palace on the Black Sea coast of Paraskeivka village next to the Mr. Putin's palace is the palace of the Patriarch Kirill. So that it shows that the hierarchy is some kind of important element of this corrupt / Chekist mafia state that actually running the country right now.
Actually, Andrei's remarks bring to my mind an incident when I was a correspondent for the Financial Times in Moscow. I investigated. One of my friends at that time was Father Gleb Yakunin. I knew him. He was the head of a group to defend the rights of believers, and he sent people to me, and I talked to them. I talked to one guy from the provinces. He told me his example of how infiltrated the Russian Orthodox Church was by the KGB. He, late in life, decided he wanted to be baptized, and he went to see his priest, who asked him, "Is it really possible that someone your age actually believes in God?" And so you never know who it is, who is your priest. But in any case, this gentleman in the red tie at the very back, if you could just identify yourself and then.
Hi, I'm Larry Smirrin, and among other hats I wear, I'm an adjunct professor at University of Maryland. On that note, I just want to make a comment and then a question. Over the last 7 years, I've been teaching students at Irkutsk State University in Irkutsk, Russia, near the Lake Baikal. And I only bring this up in reference to the early gentleman's question and adding a bit to what the Chinese might say, the sun is high and the emperor's far away. This is about 5 time zones east of Moscow. And the emphasis on the state from the feedback I've been getting over many years from the students is much less. However, the cynicism is there in that the oligarchs run everything and the state is corrupt. Not domineering, but corrupt. But yet we have hope because these young people, and these are college-age students, they believe that the system, the future for them can be better. Many of them have traveled They have access to technology. They have ideas about starting new businesses. And they believe in the future, I think, very much unlike their parents, certainly their grandparents, many of whom ended up there in the first place because they were exiled to Siberia. But having said that, let me ask my question, and it dovetails a bit on the earlier gentleman's question, and that is, under the Soviet Union, of course, there were, I believe, 16 constituent republic within the Union.
15,
15, excuse me. That include the Balts, that include
16 was
Ukraine.
Karela-Finska under Mr. Stalin, so to be correct.
Oh, it was?
Okay, 15, 16, you get my point. Now, how were they were not ethnically Russians, as we see when the Soviet Union broke up, they were glad to declare independence, but for 75 years, they were 3 generations, they were under the Soviet system. I would ask the panel in general, on the whole, did they buy into the system, or how were they brought into the system as not being Russians and having a history of wanting to have their own independence within their own, perhaps corrupt regimes themselves? I'm thinking particularly.
So how were the non-Russians
yes, I guess
integrated into the system?
That's the way to put it. Yes.
Yeah. Well, each of them, the history of every nationality in the Soviet Union was rewritten, whether they were Lithuanians, Estonians, Yakuts, Armenians, Kazakhs, Buryats, whatever they happen to be. In the case of every national history, it was reinterpreted to show that the logical culmination of the history of this people was their becoming part of the fraternal family of Soviet peoples. That everything in their history aspired to this, and being part of the Soviet Union was the realization of every positive aspiration that they may have had. So in the case, for example, of the Baltic republics, which were occupied, the interpretation was, well, there was bourgeois Lithuania, which the Lithuanians refer to as independent Lithuania. Then there was Soviet Lithuania, which of course was a big improvement over bourgeois Lithuania, and people had no choice but, and this was drummed into people's heads, and if they wanted to make a career, they had no choice but to repeat this, and by dint of repetition, many people began to believe it. Andre, go ahead, or Miriam.
Yeah, I think on the question of kind of have the other post-Soviet states had a similar reckoning. I don't know if you were thinking about that, but it also in terms of this is what happened in Moscow, but what happened in the regions. I feel like the Moscow at least had some, and through Memorial, through this trial of the Communist Party in the early 90s, late 80s, there was. It didn't fully come to fruition, but there were some efforts to look critically at the past and to try to establish responsibility. I feel like in the other, at least in Central Asia, Caucasus, it hasn't even started. It might be different in Ukraine or in the Baltics, but it's easier for the other states to say, for instance, Georgia, to say this was imposed on us by the Russians, and never really examine the nature of the purges or what had really happened within sort of Soviet Georgia in the 30s, for instance, which would also open up all kinds of issues for that country. And that remains, this issue remains for all of the successor states to some degree, bigger for Russia, but.
I'd like just to make a short comment on the comment that the gentleman has made concerning the possible role of new technologies, access to new information, the higher living standards, and so on, as the potential resource or background for democratic evolution or some kind of rule of law based society. That was the mantra from our American colleagues and actually Westerners for last 40 or 50 years, and actually we all believed in it. Unfortunately, the reality happened to be slightly different. what we found, based on our own experience of the last 20 years, as we found after that in some experience of other countries, that the raising of living standards, the raising of incomes, the raising of some kind of widening access to new technologies, even new information, even just some kind of complete removal of the Iron Curtain and so on, do not lead to democracy, neither immediately nor even with some lags. The very fact that Mr. Putin now became much richer than he was back when he was in Dresden residence, and now he has, I don't know how many billions he owns, or whatever window, or what kind of palaces he is using for rest and so on, it does not make him a Democrat. The 100 or more than 100 Mercedes and Lamborghinis that Mr. Kadyrov is using for his trips around the Chechnya does not make him human rights defender. And I can continue, as Mr. Sechin has been mentioned here and so on. That just this kind of traditional understanding that some kind of mainstream understanding that is very popular in the West and partially in the East, that actually making country rich would lead to democracy or rule of law, let me say, is factually incorrect. We need to think about these relations much more seriously.
Now, unfortunately, we have a lot of people who would like to ask questions, and we're pretty much out of time. So what I'll ask is, one by one, let's try to get the remaining questions, and then each of us on the panel will kind of give answers as best we can. Why don't we start with this lady here, and then just identify yourself and give your question, and then we'll pass the microphone around to other people who also want to.
Democracy Work. Deborah Kayatani from Democracy Work.
Can you speak up a bit?
Deborah Kayatani from Democracy Work. The question I had for Andre was on state-sponsored terrorism and agitation propaganda. Do you feel you have, Russia has a history or tradition of understanding of agitation propaganda between the United States, Hollywood, and Russian entertainment? Do you feel the tradition has been maintained or is being continued? Or is that your problem you feel with communication? Is that the disconnect between Putin and the government, the so-called mafia that may or may not be directed from outside narcotics terrorist sources? Is this agitation propaganda and state-sponsored terrorism to you, or is this a totally different animal?
Let's get a few more questions, because and then we'll all try to answer those. Yeah, this John.
Greg Thielman, Arms Control Association. I'm a little confused about the prescription you're writing for dealing with Russia in terms of foreign and security policy. We don't vote in the next Russian election. Are you advocating regime change? And what is the mechanism for gaining that? Aren't we better off getting 60% of our supplies to our troops in Afghanistan through Russia rather than the Khyber Pass? Aren't we better off having U.S. inspectors getting into the most sensitive facilities of Russian strategic forces and so forth?
Hi, my name is Jessica Fugate. I'm a paralegal and just have an avid interest in your Asian affairs. My question is about Transcaucasia. You'd mentioned the relationship with Russia and Uzbekistan. I'll just add South Ossetia. What is your take on Putin's relationship, and possibly whoever's, if Putin does not win, with Azerbaijan? And do you think that they are utilizing the conflict with Armenia as leverage against the region's ability to continue to redefine its separate identity thanks to its placement with the BTC pipeline?
Okay, and we've got, I think, 3 more questions. This lady, please, and then this gentleman, and then...
Yes, thank you. I'm from Latvian Embassy, and I'm interested in finding out your opinion about...
Can you speak up just a bit?
I'm from Latvian Embassy, and I'm interested in finding out the opinion of the panel about Russia's denial of its tragic past, do you think it's personal based, it's generation based? So can it end by losing some personalities in the Russian elite, or by the change of generations? Thank you.
And this gentleman, and then
Hi, I'm Yale Richmond, a former Foreign Service officer who worked on the Soviet affairs for many, many years. I want to thank the panel for telling us about all the terrible things that happened, but there's one thing I missed, and I'll use a Russian expression, что делать? What can be done? What can we in the West do to ensure that those terrible things you described don't happen again?
and text.
Fleming Fuller, I'm a filmmaker. David, I'm still dealing with the profundity of this observation of the criticalness of the addressing of the past. And, you know, I'm almost thinking it's equivalent of denial for someone that's a drug addict or whatnot. What is your prescription for assisting in having a cultural transformation that will enable the Russian people to become more healthy in this respect, that could lead to more democratic and freedom-based concepts?
Okay, on the basis of those questions, I'll ask each of the panelists to make a kind of brief response, and then I will. And Andre, do you want to, Bob, do you want to start with the questions addressed to you, or that
Sure,
deal with?
I'll just briefly say on the question of the Khyber Pass, I totally remove myself from this belief that it's a zero-sum game. I think we're accepting the mafia game of the Russian, of the clan in power, that if we criticize, they cut off everything. That's not negotiation. That's not true. Let me assure you that we can change Russian policy dramatically today. Very simple prescription. You take the top 100 members of the Kremlin, and you say they're not allowed to travel, and if they are not going to do a number of things in terms of moving towards rule of law, and you make them have to deal with civil penalties for some of their conduct which occurs outside of Russia and which impacts things like energy or whatnot. That actually gives you leverage. This constant view that if we criticize or if we hardball, that therefore there will be, Iran will blow up and this will happen, I totally disagree. People negotiate. It's not normally necessary for one side to submit and surrender before those negotiations take place. I don't know why the reset so often appears to me in that way. But it's not necessary and it's wrong. And one of the most important things we need to understand is you are voting in this election. And let me explain that. By treating Putin and Sechin and Medvedev and the gang the way we have legitimized them. We have allowed them to steal this election, not change their laws, jerry-rig parliament, jerry-rig the Duma elections, and allow themselves to believe that they can carry it off. So we're all voters. And, the Magnitsky case and the leadership's reaction to the Magnitsky case, which has involved not finding culpability in this poor man's death, but rather to attack the United States for even addressing it, goes a long way to showing what the Achilles heel of the leadership is. And I think it's really sad that we haven't tried to address some of these issues in a very targeted, very surgical way, so as to do it in a graduated, incremental way. That's my reaction to that question. In reaction to the question of whether this denial is generational, I frankly believe, in fact, my views on Russia are more towards yours, sir, in terms of being hopeful about the future. One of the great things happens to be the internet. I've had a blog on Russia for 5 or 6 years that's grown tremendously, and we've been interacting with a lot of Russians, not of my demographic, but more of yours. And I do see a tremendous amount of growth in the ability to communicate, at least online, if that's not closed. As you know, yesterday LiveJournal was closed. But I think the key thing is that we need to become, those of us engaged in Russia can't just read books. We can't just leave the debate to others. We need, you know, the common point I've made when I spoke in Russia was Russians were not born without the DNA of freedom. We need to not think this is somehow historically predetermined. And that's why I used the example of Thailand, where actual really dramatic change in a society that's incredibly closed and difficult. Real dramatic change has occurred in the last number of years, which actually resulted in the change of regime.
Okay, Miriam, do you
Let me kind of start maybe with Putin and the comeback of Putin in regional policy, Russian foreign policy in the former Soviet space. I think you have to start with this event in the fall when Medvedev actually nominated Putin for president. This was such a, for me, and I think for a lot of people, it was just a kind of tearing the mask off, even though maybe many people thought that Putin was in charge anyway, that it's not that he's coming back, it's that he never left. Yet for 4 years, there was a kind of game being played between Medvedev and Putin. And it really, I think, had a profound backlash in society. What we saw yesterday is that with all kinds of manipulations, with keeping the opposition, not permitting the opposition to run, having total dominance of media, shutting down the internet, with all of that, still United Russia got about 50%. And that's what you need for Putin to win on the first round. So it's something is kind of, on one hand, something is changing, on the other hand, it's not clear how it can be expressed. So I think the hopeful thing is that there's a very strong protest going on in Russia. On the policy towards Central Asia Caucasus, it's the speech, the Eurasianist speech on kind of reintegrating the space. It's been fairly continuous. It's developing, but it has been around at least since the 90s, actually, since like the mid-90s and Primakov, and the idea that the CIS would be a counterbalance to NATO and so forth. So it's kind of stale. To me, reading that kind of Eurasianist thing, it's stale in the way that the party congresses are stale and kind of Soviet in flavor, not just in kind of moral, but just this all-Russian People's Front that was launched on the anniversary of World War II, and it had this just incredibly deja vu feel to it. And that's kind of how Eurasianism feels as well, that really, do you think that it's possible at this point? Maybe it is, and there's all kinds of levers that can be applied and have been applied in obviously with the occupation of Georgia, with forcing Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to join the customs union. But those are kind of manipulation of neighboring states. The idea that you can recreate some kind of union seems, again, it just seems so stale. And then in terms of generational change and что делать, I think that maybe the sort of the prescription is to get at accountability from other angles, not from the big question of who's responsible for killing 20 million people, but through I don't know, ecological laws or budget accountability, the kinds of things that are very popular in Russia right now, is anti-corruption crusades. Navalny, who's an activist who works on those kinds of issues, so maybe the hopeful idea is that maybe by working on those issues, you can build up to the bigger issues of accountability, and also that the kind of Russian opposition, Russian civil society keeps improving over time. It becomes stronger. So those are kinds of the ideas for where to go.
Okay, and Andre?
Okay, 3 questions, 3 short answers. The first one concerning this agitation, propaganda, and all this story. I don't know whether I understand your question correctly, but I would mention that over the last 12 years, the current political regime has used different some kind of targets for its propaganda. They choosing on purpose the enemy in their propaganda war and using for some kind of for getting to the power and staying in the power. In '99 and after that, the 4 years period, there was some kind of anti-Chechen propaganda that just that some kind of they trying to consolidate power. In year 2003, it was an anti-oligarchic propaganda. In 1997, it was an anti-Orange Revolution propaganda. After having tried all these enemies, they found that at this moment Russian society do not react to any of these so-called some kind of threats. And that is why they moved back, looks like, to the some kind of traditional target, America, NATO, West. And some kind of several statements from Putin and Medvedev recently just only confirmed this stance, and that means, if it is true, so we will see it at least in the coming years, the some kind of the official target of the some kind of Kremlin propaganda, the main enemy, West, American aid, and so on. Second question concerning this recommendation to foreign policy and what is to be done. So I'm not an advisor anymore, and certainly not to the U.S. government and to the U.S. society. It's up to you to decide what you're going to do. But I think it is important just to see into the lessons of history. It's not the first time that some kind of the West of the world is dealing with similar threats, similar problems. Some kind of 70 years plus, we had a very similar situation with the rising totalitarian or authoritarian regime in Germany, and with appeasement policy towards that regime. And that time, some Western leaders, including Mr. Daladier and Mr. Chamberlain, were thinking that, okay, they're just pacifying and appeasing that regime, and some kind of trying to get something, or some kind of just, it would be absolutely wrong to demonize some kind of regime in Berlin, so we need to do something. Just we know what happened after that. It's just a fact of life. Unlike Chamberlain and Daladier, who did know what could happen after that policy, we know what happened. And so that is why we can actually learn some lessons. And frankly speaking, it's not only some kind of these creative comparison. It's not only internal issue of Russia, what is going on with authoritarian regime and with the mafia state. Russian troops occupying 20% of the Georgian territory of independent state that is just member of the United Nations. And actually, if you look into this, it was aggression that has been organized for a number of years, and after that with the stage of this hot war in year 2008. And just on historical timetable, it's something similar after October 1938 and before March 1939 with occupation of Sudetenland by the German troops. What is the difference? No difference at all. So that is why, based on this experience, we can think what kind of lessons we could learn. And another comparison I would make, okay, just try to make these some kind of big international issues closer to your own body and just to your understanding. You are living with the mafia boss next door. No, it's a fact. Okay, so and just you living with mafia boss next door. What is your policy? Are you invited him to your some kind of tea party with your wife and with your kids? No, is it just okay? Or you're trying to some kind of strengthen the door, or some kind of to keep police alert all the time. Just it's a different. Okay, if you start to invite to the some kind of the Thanksgiving some kind of parties to your some kind of to neighbor, just whom you should some kind of blame for what will happen to you on your family, on your kids, only you yourself. My last some kind of comment on this question from the lady from Latvian embassy about this denial of the past. There are two reasons, at least, certainly maybe more, but the two most important. One of this is kind of corporationist memory, because it just if you go back to some kind of to the history, so just you would undermine this some kind of the basic fundamental roots of the corporations that is running the country. So that is why exposing the crimes of these corporations or the predecessors of this corporation, you undermine the political power and position of this corporation. Actually, in very many ways, it is still continued to be today. And second, it is certainly very personal ties to the past. That's something that is not being discussed at all in the Russian society, and it is touched in the David's book, and it is very important that we all living in the current Russia some kind of has ties to our fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and their positions in that some kind of 1 century civil war, some kind of is different. Some people were on one side and some people on the other side. Some people have been in the camps and in jails, and some people have been killed, and some people were killing, and some people were guards in those jails and camps. I can just mention the experience that I had, not this summer, but previous summer. That probably it was one of the gruesome experience of my life, because I visited one place in eastern Siberia where there was a camp of Gulag was. And it's not Moscow, it's not St. Petersburg, it's absolutely different. And the population of this little, it's not a village, it's some kind of settlement, about maybe 3,000 people. It is shocking because this population consists of the former inmates and former guards of that camp, of this Gulag camp. Gulag camp has been some kind of closed in 1950s, late 1950s, and it does not exist. But because inmates cannot go to the previous places of their living, and guards also, they live together in the same settlement, and everybody knows who was just these themselves and their some kind of predecessors and their kids, and who were whom just several decades ago. And it is striking what is the social structure of this settlement, because all high position in the some kind of this little small society, with some kind of the head of administration, the some kind of representatives to all these local branches, with the some kind of big merchants, so-called big on this size, or just whatever. All of them are from the guards, none of them from inmates. So that is why this structure that has been created some kind of several decades ago is being some kind of transformed with some kind of marketized to a new situation, but social structure remains intact. And that is it's something that it just is not being even discussed, not even some kind of recommending how to deal with this situation.
Okay, well, thanks to our panel, and thanks to all of you for coming. I'd like to remind to everyone that we're going to show this documentary film based on my first book on December 14th at Johns Hopkins University. There are flyers that I believe have been left on your chairs, and I'll make one final remark that as far as what to do, I think the influence of the West is moral influence, and that's we can't vote in elections there, and we can't stage a coup, but we can promulgate those values and propound those values that will have resonance in Russia itself, and that eventually is really, I think, the only hope for the country's future. But in any case, thank you for coming. And okay, bye.